I am a virus. Chapter 3, The Virus in Chinese Culture. 6. The Soil of the Cultural Revolution. Today's younger generation in China may not fully realize that the 1980s were the most politically relaxed period since the founding of the People's Republic of China. Back then, although I was still young, I read some books and articles reflecting on the Cultural Revolution 1966 to 1976 and found this man-made disaster truly incomprehensible. Out of curiosity, I once asked my father what he was doing during that time. Was he part of the rebels? I remember his firm response: he was not part of the rebels, nor did he ever engage in the violent struggles. However, when I asked what he actually did during those years, or how he viewed the Cultural Revolution, he always avoided the topic. This avoidance made me more curious. I knew he wasn't a rightist, a target of persecution during the early years of the PRC, and Wuhan, where we lived, had serious armed struggles during that period. It was likely that he didn't participate in them either. So, if he wasn't a rightist or a rebel, what was he trying to emphasize by avoiding the question? He seemed to stress that he hadn't done anything wrong during the Cultural Revolution. At the time, I wasn't satisfied with this vague answer. As a child, I felt that as a father, he had a responsibility to explain to me what exactly happened in China during those years. I was young and naive, and I thought that anyone who survived such a disaster was not entirely innocent. Beyond the perpetrators and the victims, anyone who considered themselves innocent was still complicit in some way. Everyone in the country had some role to play in the disaster. I even believed that my father, who thought he had stayed within the lines, was also a participant. I felt that anyone with a sense of justice should have done something. If someone did nothing and still believed they were innocent, I thought that was cowardice. So, during the early years of my career, my motivation was clear: work hard, make money, learn the skills necessary to run a company, and eventually, I would use that wealth to build a Cultural Revolution Memorial Museum. This was one of my most important life goals at the time. But as the years passed, I felt a sense of shame. Although I never completely gave up on this dream, it gradually faded away. In 2018, China's latest version of high school history textbooks removed the chapter on the Cultural Revolution and instead condensed the background, process, and harm into a section titled Difficult Exploration and Achievements. This was clearly an attempt to downplay the Cultural Revolution, turning it into a so-called difficult exploration to reinforce the Communist Party's legitimacy and minimize the crimes they committed. How did I respond to this calculated reframing? I didn't even dare to write a mocking post on Weibo. In China today, young people under the age of May 30 not even know about the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, let alone the Cultural Revolution from 50 years ago. Orwell's famous quote, "He who controls the past controls the future, he who controls the present controls the past," has become a reality in China. With the help of high technology, China's control has surpassed even Orwell's imagination in 1984. 30 years ago, the leaders in power, having personally experienced the persecution of the Cultural Revolution, were deeply wary of it. They made clear statements regarding its nature, acknowledging its catastrophic impact. Despite their authoritarian tendencies, the government didn't encourage a comprehensive reflection on the Cultural Revolution, but at least the concept of the 10-year catastrophe was accepted by society before Xi Jinping took power. However, the 2018 revisions to textbooks fully align with Xi's authoritarian logic, and since his ascent, the country has taken serious steps backward. I don't wish to analyze his motivations and errors here. What concerns me more is our collective responsibility. Just as my father avoided telling me the truth about the Cultural Revolution, today's young people are unaware of the June 4 Tiananmen massacre. Clearly, this is because their fathers never told them the truth about the military's massacre of students. Even in the face of China's so-called 30 years of economic miracle, some fathers still genuinely believe that the government's violent suppression of the Tiananmen protests was the right decision. This, in my opinion, is the crux of the problem. As Solzhenitsyn, writing the Gulag Archipelago in secret, was once advised, let the past be the past. Always dwelling on the past will cause you to lose one eye. His response was, the second half of the saying is, forget the past, and you will lose both eyes. Solzhenitsyn was reminding us that a nation without memory has no future. Unfortunately, it is painfully obvious that the Chinese people do not care about the future. We are focused on the present, a characteristic of our national psyche. We do not consider the punishments that might come from repeating history. Instead, we pray that we will be the lucky ones who escape disaster without taking responsibility. China is not without its occasional self-reflective voices. The renowned writer B.A. Jin is one such example. In his later years, he wrote random thoughts to personally reflect on the Cultural Revolution, saying, I have a responsibility to expose this grand scam and prevent future generations from suffering the same fate. B.A. Jin, who had been brutally persecuted during the Cultural Revolution, did not regard himself merely as a victim. His reflection on the Cultural Revolution carried a sense of penitence. We all went mad during the Cultural Revolution. Others criticized me, but didn't I also harm others? His reflection was born from a larger concern for both history and the future. 10 years ago, a Chinese friend living abroad excitedly told me that after reading Random Thoughts, he was optimistic because China still had such self-reflection. He believed that this gave China hope. I wasn't as optimistic. I told him that the soil for another cultural revolution still existed in China. Individual reflections, like B.A. Jin's, cannot change the soil. If there isn't a collective national reflection, symbolized by a cultural revolution memorial museum, then another cultural revolution is simply a matter of time. If China is lucky enough to avoid such a disaster in the future, it will likely be due to external factors because the gates are open, because the world is watching, and perhaps because others will intervene to prevent such a human tragedy. I have reached this conclusion because I understand China and its people. Humanity is a mixture of good and evil. As long as the authoritarian system remains, integrity and kindness will be hidden as weaknesses, while evil will always have the potential to be triggered and grow. Economic growth has not weakened the authoritarian system, rather, it has enhanced its efficiency. A relatively affluent life has not become a motivation for us to fight for freedom and rights. This is because China's authoritarian system is the crystallization of Chinese culture, and everyone is complicit in the existing system. According to friends within the system, the Cultural Revolution has already returned in a new form, with internal political struggles within the party under the guise of anti-corruption. Mutual denunciations and purges of millions of officials have become commonplace, replicating the tactics of the Cultural Revolution. During the Wuhan pandemic, we also saw brutal actions taken under the name of epidemic prevention, a reflection of ordinary people once again finding the same sense of power they had during the Cultural Revolution. The urge to bully others only requires a small trigger, and it can easily be released. In a jungle society, the oppressed and the oppressors are two sides of the same coin. The oppressed endure because they can always find someone weaker to oppress. The lowest classes, eager to succeed, resort to more violent methods, and once they succeed, their rule is even more brutal. This explains why every regime change in China has been marked by bloodshed and why the Cultural Revolution was so brutal.